Hello and welcome to this CNBC Africa Special report right here as we speak about aviation, the aviation industry in Africa. Is it on track? We've seen tremendous growth over the past at least 10 years, you can count that, but we sit down with experts in this particular industry to break down a few of the things that have actually happened, significant contributions to this particular industry, and we get to understand where the continent is actually headed with this industry. Now, joining us today from my exact left is Garma Wake. He is the aviation advisor for Togo Civil Aviation Authority, but he's also the former CEO for Ethiopian Airlines. And just right next to him is Adefunke Adeyemi, who is the International Air Transport Association there for IATA. Thank you for joining us as well. And we will have Chris Zwai Gento from Airlines Association of Southern Africa. He is the Chief Executive Officer. Gentlemen and lady, thank you for creating time to speak to us today. Now, you've definitely created time to speak to us about this, and I just want to start from where we are, right? The Aviation Africa 2019. Much of the conversation happening is how to fly together. What do we make of this? I think I'll start with the lady in the midst.
Thank you very much. The business of aviation is built on cooperation. Starting from way back when the Chicago Convention was signed, when countries and stakeholders came together to see how to develop civil aviation, the whole business of this industry has been built on cooperation. And I gave an example yesterday that whenever you get on a plane, you take off and you land, many times as a passenger you don't think about the overflights, the number of countries that you're flying over in terms of their airspace, and the background cooperation that those countries have allowed between themselves to allow that flight to take place. And that's just one example. There's so many more. The whole ecosystem of aviation is built on cooperation. And so cooperation is critical. And for Africa as a continent, with our demographic, our size, etc., we believe that aviation in the short to medium term can really be a game changer for this continent, can really transform how we do business, how we trade with each other, how we educate each other, how we give aid, how we learn. So many parts of modern society and human existence can be done with aviation. But without the cooperation across all the different stakeholder levels, both from government, the industry itself, and the players that support that industry, then it would be quite difficult to realize the gains that we see that are possible for Africa. For example, we project, the IATA economic forecast for the next 20 years is that aviation in Africa will be the third fastest growing in the world after Asia Pacific and the Middle East. And so if that is the case, then we need all of the enablers that will support that growth and enable that growth in the next 20 years. We have the demographics that can support that growth, but without that cooperation across the stakeholder base in terms of safety, security, infrastructure, the relevant staff, the relevant kind of regulation, the economics of the business itself, the financial health of the airlines, then it's going to be tricky. But I'll stop here so that I give my colleagues an opportunity to also speak to this issue.
Your take on this, Garma?
It's true, the cooperation is a very important part of aviation. It's also true, aviation is a very expensive undertaking. To buy an aircraft, you pay $150 million, $200 million. And to maintain that airplane, the maintenance organization that you create is a very expensive one. To train the person who flies it takes about 18 months and costs $70,000, $80,000 per person. To get a maintenance a student from school, put him through a maintenance course, takes, probably the training takes 2 years, But then, as soon as he graduates, he doesn't go and fix airplanes. He would have to take more training. So it's a very expensive project. Because of this expense, and because aviation covers the world, it's always easier to share the burden. If 10 African carriers agree between themselves to train their pilots, their technicians in the same school, the cost will be distributed. If one airline runs it, it's very expensive. The same thing with maintenance. As per holding, when you buy a new airplane, is a lot of money. It is a big portion of the aircraft price. But if 3, 4, 5 countries or 10 countries get together and say, okay, this will be our center of maintenance, our spare parts will be bought and kept together, the inventory will serve all of us, the cost element will go down for everybody. So cooperation and competition at the same time, because they have to fight on the same market. But even then, they can cooperate by feeding passengers from one to the other, cargo from one to the other. So I think, even though the nature of the business is that they compete between themselves, it's also true that they have to do a lot of cooperation between themselves.
Right. Chris, let me bring you into this conversation. Of course, as someone that is the Chief Executive Officer for the Southern African Association for, of course, this industry as well. I just want to pick your mind on this particular conversation. She talks about trade, she talks about infrastructure, and talks about how cooperation could actually bring in, cut down on how much is spent by every airline going on its own, or every country trying to do it on its own. And he brings in a very interesting perspective here. You have to put a very big financial budget behind training pilots and engineers and operations. Tell me, how do you see this actualizing, this cooperation, and what do you think needs to be set up to actually see that working out?
Well, just to get the context as well, and to add to what they've said, is
right.
Obviously you've got 54 states, and historically everybody's wanted their own flag carrier. And the problem has been, because of the lack of really getting together and starting cooperation, you've got each airline with 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 airlines, and now some airlines up to 100 aircraft, as Ethiopian SAA around about the 50 aircraft level. The problem is the unit cost base as well as the utilization of the aircraft. And to start an airline, you need some of the basics. Is that there's a huge overhead structure that has to be set up to be able to operate the airline. And one of the big problems is to try and get the unit cost down so that you can charge a competitive fare, and so that a passenger is willing to pay what they are being asked to pay in Africa. So the big problem is now to try and find a way to get those unit costs down, and that's why the cooperation of finding ways in which you could actually get into alliances such as the Star Alliance, the One Worlds, and the Sky Team alliances are doing internationally. Some of the bigger airlines in Africa have joined those larger alliances, but a lot of the smaller airlines are at a disadvantage because they can't piggyback on some of those advantages of a much wider market. And that. So the cooperation, the alliance process is something that needs to work, but through a process of which I'm sure you want to talk about, the whole liberalization concept of the single African air transport market, where you can actually open up and enable even the smaller airlines to start to develop some of their niche market, not necessarily compete on the big trunk routes with the big airlines, but to be able to increase the feed through network enhancement and process. I think that's maybe a starting point to start looking at.
Chris, you just mentioned there the likes of Ethiopian having about hundreds plus of 120 plus, right? He's the former CEO of Ethiopian Airlines, so he knows best, right? So I just want us to look at the fleet. Of course, you're mentioning. I think currently Rwanda has in the tens, right? Rwanda Air. 12 that's in the tens, right? So when you see the current competition, of course, competitiveness is everything, right? But when you look at the markets that are being served with, of course, respect to other airlines from even way grown aviation industries, right? Don't you think that there is call for some of the big airlines to actually form an alliance, and this could make them have like code share or even operate these routes hand in hand and make it a lot more easier for them? I'll take that to you.
Okay. So I think that there's room for cooperation on so many different levels.
Right.
Yesterday we had conversations, and this morning as well, we heard some of our keynote speakers and the panelists mention that there is room for everyone to play in. Mm-hmm. So first of all, my point for African airlines is that the playground for African airlines is Africa. Mm. Many of the carriers around the world, most of whom are our members, etc., they have, developed markets and have developed the infrastructure and the hubs to support that. Now, it's difficult for an airline with the kinds of numbers of fleets we're talking about here from Africa to compete on those bases in a way that makes any kind of economic sense. But in order to grow the critical mass for Africa, right, that allows you to feed different ways and different business models support each other for the African aviation sector to grow, there's room for us to do that. And so there's a wide scope for commercial cooperation. Right. There's also a wide scope for technical cooperation. Right. And that's an area that I don't think we're doing as much of as we can. It's the panel that we just finished talking about, maintenance, etc. It's one of the highest costs for African airlines. And that's, for different reasons. The fact that there's lack of scale, also the fact that, some of the aircraft that have been acquired over time are the older aircraft in the fleet, just based on what is affordable, right, to them, etc. Of course, many African airlines are at the cutting edge of technology and aircraft. We have some of our African airlines have Dreamliners. They have taking orders for different, A350s, etc. Right. The Boeing 737-8 MAX. There's so many of them. So this is still African airlines. Right. At the same time, you have some of the smaller ones who, in the business, are thinking about affordability and therefore have slightly older aircraft. And because of that, the cost of maintenance goes up. And as Atogima was saying earlier, the fact that you can't do it on your own. Right. If you're not cooperating properly on a technical basis, then it also adds to your cost. Now, there's something that's currently going on in Africa on safety. Right. You have something called regional safety oversight organizations. That is designed to support for states within a sub-region to support other states that don't necessarily have the capacity to conduct safety oversight in terms of their own autonomy. And so other states support them to do that. There's no reason why we can't have the same kind of model for technical cooperation amongst the airlines. And that's exactly what we need to be promoting. These are the kinds of things we're talking about. Also, in terms of talent, I think it's something that you want to talk about as well, and has already been mentioned. Again, this whole idea of creating a pool of talent that you can almost, share from. And that's really the only way to grow this market. You need to grow the critical mass in terms of numbers, volume, and scale, so that you can, have a chance. And you also need to look at how you cooperate across different levels.
Right. Gama, right.
We want it to be done more. Otherwise, it does exist. Like, for example, if you take Rwanda Air, they use Ethiopian Airlines to do their maintenance for the Q400s and for the 737s. If you take Air Tanzania, they take Ethiopian Airlines for their 787s and their Q400s. ASKY uses entirely Ethiopian Airlines. There are carriers that are working like that, but it should not be a rare example. It should be a normal way of doing things. Carriers should really get together and work together so that the industry as a whole will benefit. Otherwise, it does happen. It does happen.
Let's speak on a policy level, right? It's very, very glad that you also are most in this conversation where some of the policies are made. Currently, when you look at the aerospace here in Africa, only 3 countries stand out to be benefiting from this, and that's, of course, South Africa, Tunisia, and Morocco, right? I'm even more surprised that Ethiopia is not in the...
Just starting.
All right. Just speak to me, though, like when we look at the African Union Agenda 2063, where we're looking at least 50 years to grow socio-economic development, right? How do you think East African countries, or actually countries on the continent, let's make it a Pan-African conversation, could benefit more in creating policies that could enable this business to fruition? I'll start with you, Gama.
When you buy an airplane, there are some benefits that you can negotiate. Not only the price of the airplane. And those benefits are things like building capacity to do some things, like when we ordered the 787, we negotiated with Boeing to help us start a wire harness. Today, we supply wire harness to Boeing and Airbus. Where Morocco did better than the rest of us is, it's not just the airline. They created an organization that will start an aerospace industry. They trained engineers, technicians, brought them together and started getting the contract. And the aircraft manufacturers will help with this. It's one of the things that you can negotiate when you buy an airplane. And it is also to their advantage to get supplies, parts from a country where the cost is not so high. So for their own benefit also, they will support with equipment, with training and everything else. If Africa could really sit and think to develop an aerospace industry, maybe individually it could be a bit difficult. But if East Africa starts something like this, there are industrial zones. When you establish an industrial zone, also include that, and start building some of the things that are necessary to supply to aircraft manufacturers, to aerospace industries. It can be done. Ethiopia is starting one, but I think instead of individually starting that, it is better to pool our resources together, get our young people from different African countries to go to that point and start producing together. It will be a big advantage. Maybe, who knows, one day we will start manufacturing our own airplanes.
What are some of the lessons that we can learn from South Africa? I was speaking to Airbus today morning, and they're like, we are already making some of the parts in South Africa. So maybe on a regulatory ground or level, what are some of the things that you think East Africa, West Africa, or even the Maghreb region, of course the part of Africa, could learn from this?
I mean, clearly they had the infrastructure on which to actually start building, and that was a big advantage. And I think that's where a number of big companies are starting the manufacturing and the parts. And they went through quite a process to get an accreditation from, say, a Boeing and an Airbus to be able to manufacture specific parts. Right. And they're doing it. So obviously they did that. There was a lot of training, and one of the aspects I wanted to come back to as well in terms of this expanding through into the rest of Africa is the fact that the harmonization of regulations and policies is actually something that we need to work on. And I think we've spoken about this. There are different policies, and when you have a compliance between of certain states with the standards and recommended practices of IATA, there are differing levels of compliance amongst the states. And that harmonization, ensuring that we get the right regulations approved and that they're harmonized across the states to enable people to be able to, for example, get another state to come and get the parts from South Africa, or enable them to take them to another state and say those are acceptable because of a certain standards, that's an important aspect. So we need to get a harmonization of standards and practices and regulations, and harmonized regulations, ensuring the civil aviation policy across all the states is also fairly aligned, because that's also an issue. And it's 54 states. It's actually quite a task to actually get that done. Yeah.
Right. You're from Kenya, and I want to bring this back to you as the IATA office in Kenya also, maybe on the regulation bit, not necessarily your mandate or docket or whatever that is, but currently we just saw Monday. This Monday, Sebastian Mikosi, the CEO of Kenyan Airways, appearing before Parliament and saying that we see this as the only way out to help the Kenyan flag carrier that is currently not having a very good financial, time. How do regulations go down to heart airline business? Like currently, the merger between KQ and KAA can't go because regulations.
So first of all, I'm Nigerian. I've been told I look East African, so that's all right. No problem. You're forgiven.
No, definitely. I understand.
No, it's fine. Not a problem. So, but I understand your question. So, in terms of how regulation can harm the industry, honestly, it's absolutely fundamental to everything.
Sure.
First of all, you know that regulation cuts across every part of aviation. How the business is run. And of course it makes sense because, you know, this is an industry that's carrying people and goods, and you expect that that is done, exactly, this is life, right? So you expect it's done safely, securely, and sustainably. And so this is important. What we don't want as an industry is when the regulations are not is over-regulation, or when the regulations are not favorable. And when we say favorable, we're not saying, oh, you know, give us undue advantage. We're saying actually just allow us to grow sustainably with the right kind of regulations that support sustainable growth. And that is really important. Now, let's talk about some aspects of regulation that could harm the industry. Taxes and charges. Right. This is something that we've talked about. As IATA, we advocate, along with ICAO and our partners, against excessive taxes and charges on the industry. Not because we don't recognize states' rights to do this, or the providers or suppliers of the facilities to charge for the usage of them, but because if it's done excessively, then it puts such an undue burden on the operators that it makes it very difficult for them to grow and get those economies of scale that we're talking about. And so as a result of this, you know, IATA in conjunction with the OECD came up with something called smarter regulation, which are principles that focus on how you design regulation and how you implement them. And this was taken to ICAO. So at the last ICAO assembly, it was adopted, and there's now a policy guideline, an ICAO policy guideline called Good Regulatory Practices, which states can adopt and focus on in terms of how they regulate different aspects of the industry. There's also the guidelines from ICAO as well on taxation and on user charges. And basically these focus on, you know, some key principles on advanced notification, on consultation, on cost relatedness, and a few other things which are relevant. So what again we're saying is it's not just about the regulation itself, it's also carrying the industry along, because don't forget that the whole system of aviation is designed around the operations of aviation, and those operations are done by the carriers. And so those regulations impact everything they do: the safety, their oversight, how the airlines are operating, efficiencies, infrastructure, you know, name it, ground handling, every aspect of it. So it's important to ensure that, you know, those regulations really do support the ability of the industry to grow and grow sustainably. Don't forget that this is an industry that has grown tremendously over the past 100 years, and today carries 4.4 billion people. I mean, to get to that stage, even with all of the regulations, it means that there are some very good ones. The technical standards, for example, that come out of ICAO, etc., it has supported that growth. It has supported innovation. It has supported us to be able to do things differently on so many different levels. But what we need to just be mindful of is how we ensure that the right regulations are put in place. And finally, in terms of the wider policy, strategic policy initiatives, right now, yesterday we were talking about the focus of the African Union on connectivity. And the three elements of connectivity, which they're starting with. Out of the 12 AU Agenda flagship projects, they focused on the first 3, which relate to connectivity. And it's part of supporting their vision, the vision of the African Union, to really integrate Africa and to create unity and prosperity for its people. And those are 1, through air services, which is the single African air transport market; 2, through the Continental Free Trade Agreement to ease and facilitate trade across the continent; and the 3rd is the free movement movement protocol, which is the African passport and ease of visas and customs duties. So these are very positive strategic policy initiatives that just need to be domesticated across all the 54 states.
Allow me to take this break, and I will definitely pick up from where your mind is right now. I can tell there is a lot going on. Allow us to take a quick break right here on this CNBC Africa Special report. We're speaking about the aviation industry. So much happening, but we might not necessarily know it all, so we have a group of experts to break this down for us. Skip it. CNBC Africa, first in business, worldwide. Welcome back to the CNBC Africa Special report. We're speaking about the aviation industry on the continent. A great outlook here. My name is Mugisha. You can follow this conversation on Twitter at CNBC Africa. My personal handle at Galwera4. Chris, before we took this break, there was something that you wanted to say, and this is the right time.
Thank you. I just think that the question about growth is an important one to look at. For me, the question of aviation being able to be sustainable into the future is one that we've actually got to get the passengers on board the aircraft, and they've got to pay the fare, and that's got to cover the costs. We talked about, and I think Funke, and yesterday we spoke about 4.9% growth projected for Africa for the next couple of years. For me, that's just too slow. We're coming off a much lower base, and if we look at some of the achievements from some of the airlines with double-digit growth over the past 10 years, I think that's something we've got to start aiming for, because to be able to, we have to grow at greater than the global growth rate to be able to recover some of the lost market share from the international carriers, and that's got to be a goal for us. So if we say 4.9, even 5.9, I think we've got to be close to 10% growth rate on a consistent basis. But to do that, a lot of things have to happen within the airline industry. The airlines themselves have got to get into the basis where they have got a sustainable strategy, a business plan, know their markets, know the demand, and be able to put routes together that they know will actually develop, grow, and then enable them to put the passengers in the seats and then grow that process. So for me, I just think we've got to have an outlook for Africa in terms of a far greater growth than we're currently experiencing. We know that there's a huge demand for new aircraft. Both Boeing and Airbus and Bombardier and Embraer are all talking about large growth within Africa, which means we need pilots, we need aviation technicians, we need air traffic controllers to the skies. And the other aspect I think we mustn't forget about is also the other management side of the general management side, leadership of the airline industry. We've got to have governments that trust the airline management that they put in charge to say, get on with the job and do the job. They are accountable to us as the shareholder. If that's government airlines, obviously there are private shareholders as well. But we've got to get that process. And there's a huge training aspect that comes into that, which we could talk about as well. When you
definitely open this discussion up for a little bit of that, because we still see, according to the Africa Development Bank, actually, we're looking at the infrastructure needs in Africa ranging between $130 billion to $170 billion that are in need. But on the gap, financing gap there is about $68 to $108 billion. But that is one thing. Infrastructure is one thing, but also looking at the talent on the other hand, right? You're going to need a great deal of expertise, like technical expertise in this field, but also, as you mentioned, the traffic controllers and all of this. And this brings me to Adefunke. Tell me, what do you need, what do you think is necessary at this moment for the stakeholders in this industry to actually harness this issue and stand out when it comes to competitiveness? Africa is really growing, and we need to see this working out as well.
Right, you're right. I mean, so I think we alluded to this already in the discussion that we need to grow a pool of talent.
Sure.
And where do you start from? Okay, you know, there's so many areas that we can develop this from. You can start from the youth, okay? In most conventional mainstream education, we don't have aviation as part of the curriculum. You have to go to a specialized school, and that's just to become, not just, but that's to become a pilot or an engineer or a technician, right? Then, you know, we have some of the bigger organizations, global organizations like ICAO, IATA, etc., that have training and development institutes that support, you know, several elements of aviation, business, and management, okay? And then the travel agencies and all of this kind of stuff. So that's what exists today. In order for us to meet that growth, we have to go beyond what exists today. So you have to start from how you plug in aviation into the schools. Secondly, our youth. We have a median age in Africa of 19.
19, yes.
Yes, for our 1.3 billion people. And as you mentioned, I think you mentioned it in one of your opening remarks, how do we get these guys, one, interested in aviation as a career choice, and two, into that pool?
Interest might be one thing, but how do we finance actually them to take it on?
So that's the, you know, the second element. And I think you mentioned this, of course, that it's expensive to train for those technical positions. Right. But aviation is not only about the technical positions. It is a total business. And so you can be a lawyer and go into aviation. We need environmentalists. We need biologists. We need chemists. We need IT people. We need so many things. So even in mainstream education, there is a place for you to go into aviation. But beyond that, we need to really help support that future growth, not just in terms of all the enablers we've talked about, but to actively, proactively get people involved in that. Some of the examples that were given earlier, you know, the UAEs, maybe Singapore, etc., this is a concerted policy. It's something that has been planned. So we go again to the issue of planning. If you're planning for this growth, both at a policy level across Africa and in individual countries, then you'll be factoring in not just the policies and the implementation of the policy, but also the financing of the policy. That's on a statewide level. Across the industry, of course, again, we can't do it alone. It's more expensive as a standalone than if you come together. And I think, you know, I'll leave it open as well for additional comments.
I think the statistics that you quoted, Boeing, Airbus say Africa needs between now and 2035, 22,000 pilots and 29,000 technicians and around 29,000 cabin crew, and very big number of management people also. Today, if I were to start a business, I will not start business of running an airline. I will start a business of training people for aviation. There is a very big demand and there is money. And countries would really have to, you know, each country pays for the universities. University education in most parts of Africa is free. And yet, when they graduate, the students don't find a job. They become a problem. But if they support an aviation school, those same students would go there, and when they graduate, there is a guaranteed job for them. If necessary, you can even get to a point of an agreement whereby the student takes his training, finishes, starts the job, and starts paying for it later. But it can be done. An arrangement can be done. Or governments can pay. I can give you an example of what Rwanda did. When we were trying to really establish Rwanda Air, we did not have technicians, we did not have pilots, so you have to start training. You cannot always depend on others. And we approached the government. It was not easy to convince people to transfer money from one budget to another to pay for training. But when it got high enough, a decision was made that part of the higher education budget will go to train these pilots. And that is how we sent, there was even plan to send 20 pilots every year for training and around 40 technicians every year. The country, by doing that, started training young people to go into aviation. In Kenya, the banks, an arrangement was made with banks. People who go to college, if they want to go to aviation school, the banks will lend them money. And when they start working, they start paying it's a loan. So money is available. We all African countries get aid from some. If we spend some of that aid on promoting the skill in aviation, it will go a long way to support the nation. But that understanding will have to be there. That vision would have to be there within government. But it is possible.
It's absolutely right. And it goes back to the alignment of the vision. And this, what Atagema has talked about with Rwanda, doesn't happen in many other states around. There's not a budget for example, in South Africa to go and train pilots. That has to be done by the airline itself or through your own private funding. And private funding is a major problem because it's a very expensive operation to train a pilot. It's very expensive. So the problem is that there is lack of funding. One of the important things I think we're talking about as well then is to look at the possibility of finding cooperation between states in terms of setting up cadet schools and cadet academies within certain states, which requires, again, the harmonization of regulations, because in some cases you've got to make sure that if I train a pilot, say in South Africa, and they can actually go and fly in Tanzania, for example, or something like that, it should be not a problem. But sometimes we've had experiences where pilots have gone to China and they've been trained in certain states and they're not accepted in China. They've got to do another conversion over there for some reason. So, but the whole question about that's why I think one of the important things is they've just formed about a couple of years ago the African Aviation Training Organization, which is an ICAO supported function. It's also supported by IATA and also a lot of the airlines and us as well. And I think that's important to be able to make sure that you coordinate the requirements. You've got to determine, we talk a lot about the shortages, but a lot of people haven't okay, the shortage is coming, but how are we going to deal with that shortage? We haven't got to the point of actually putting the plan together of actually how we're going to deal with the shortage. And the fact that there is competition, no doubt, for certain people that are qualified, for example, to go outside of Africa, as we heard in the last panel, where people are being enticed with good packages to go outside of Africa. We've got to find ways to retain them, but initially, before you retain them, get them to that standard. Bring them there, absolutely. And that's, so I think coordination, harmonizing between organizations such as ATO and other organizations, the ICAO, Next Generation Aviation Professionals, a big organization. IATA does a lot of work through the IATA Training Fund, for example, and things like that. There's a lot of, I think there's got to be a huge focus on Africa. And money is available and it's got to be done, and we've got to coordinate it correctly so that where the shortages are coming, identify where those shortages are, identify what the quantum is, and then coordinate it accordingly. It may sound too simplistic, but we've got to start somewhere.
My next one is quite open, and because at least we're all players in this African market. So the single African air transport market, of course, some data from the IATA shows that it could actually grow the passenger rate by at least 71%. I just want you guys to wrap our minds around this. How much of demand is there for African airlines for a beginning? And two, what kind of opportunities is this presenting for African players? It's an open one.
You can start. No?
Okay, so I'm extremely passionate about this initiative. I think it's the most exciting thing that has happened to African aviation in a very long time. And it's an initiative that's designed to accelerate and speed up a framework for open skies in Africa, which has been in place for the past 30 years. So this initiative the framework is there, but the initiative is looking at the various elements of how to actualize this and accelerate the growth. So it's extremely exciting. The second thing is that it cuts across all aspects of aviation, like I said. But the starting point is the policy, right? The framework. What is the main framework? Well, it's the ability of an airline from state A in Africa to fly into state B with passengers and cargo, drop off some of those passengers, pick up others, go on into state C, do the same thing, and come back the same way doing the same thing. That is what this whole thing is about. That's just to demystify it. And so again, it goes to that intent of connectivity to create a Pan-African market, both in terms of market access, in terms of trade facilitation, in terms of free movement of people and goods. So that's the overarching principle behind it. Now, in terms of passenger demand and freight and how freight will follow, of course, Chris mentioned it. The opportunities are immense, and he said he's right in saying that the projected forecasted growth is quite conservative based on today's numbers because we're starting from a low base. Now we talk about 4.4 billion passengers globally. Africa's contribution to that is about 100 million only, and this is a continent of 1.3 billion people. So the opportunities, to your question, is immense to grow the market. The other element I want to pick up on is what he mentioned about trading. The traders, right? The guys who can buy a ticket and go and pick up their goods and so on. Well, those who can't buy a ticket are doing what? They're trading still. How are they doing it? They're going by road. And they're going by road and they have cash because they're traders and this is their livelihood. And they're going by road and putting their goods in buses, in trucks, in lorries. The idea here is that we should be able to do this same thing, to facilitate aviation in such a way that we're capturing this informal market. Because the statistics are based on what we know. But there's a lot that is going on that we can't capture because it's informal trade. So we should be able to convert these guys and bring them in. So again, the opportunities are immense. And these guys are quite aspirational. I've been on flights with many of them. A few times I've recognized them. And they do the frequent flyer mile. They go to China 5 times. They go into business class. And you can see that, this is wonderful. And you can see they're so excited about the fact that this is what aviation affords them. And so there is that aspirational element of the African population that we also need to capture. So the opportunities are immense. Now, well, you may ask why it's been 30 years, right? What are the challenges? We talked about some of it yesterday, and we've been talking about it for some time. And one of the CEOs on one of the panels actually hit the nail on the head. He mentioned what the issue is. There's some fear around what this will do to many carriers. Right. And he said, if you can give us comfort and make us understand better how this will work and do it in a phased manner.
For one, we saw some critics going towards the president of Nigeria for signing the SAATM.
Yeah, of course. And some, again, some of the carriers. So these are some of the issues that come with this, right? Where, it's a question of how do you balance out, the need for you to manage your own operations and your own, share of the market against opening up. And again, this is something that can be done in the right way and in a way that works for Africa. If the SATAM requires phasing, then let's put phasing in. Nobody is saying that SATAM is a tap that you turn on and it automatically everything is open to everybody. No, it's not supposed or designed to work that way. It's designed to work with certain rules and regulations in place. Are all the regulations in place today? No. Do all the players know the rules of the game completely? No. But again, it's working. This is what the whole point is about. So the launch has been made. The next step is implementing it. And I always, use this example, it's an African thing. How do you eat an elephant? One piece at a time. So you literally have to chip away and just take it step by step by step by step.
Right.
And we will get there.
Maybe anything else?
You know, SATM, even before we got to SATM, even YD, there was progress. Let's admit, there is change of attitude. African carriers today are flying everywhere within Africa. There are restrictions, but they still fly. There is a big improvement. Now, 28 countries have made a solemn commitment. These 28 countries represent over 80% of the traffic.
Right.
If we can handle that, those 80% of the traffic, I think it's a big jump. And to me, the problem is not governments. The problem are airline CEOs. Airline CEOs, they go to the position, they want to stay in that position, and they think by keeping everybody out and doing it by themselves, they progress. This is not true. Where there are more frequencies, where there are more airlines, there is more traffic.
Right.
But many of our CEOs believe, I will just guard this, I don't want anybody to come in, and they go to the government and say, you have got to protect me, my airline is too young. I think if we can get rid of those type of CEOs and get daring and reasonable and forward-looking CEOs, we'll get there.
Chris, before I take closing remarks, what would be your last point on the SATM? Of course.
I think the issue that Atagima makes is a point, and I've had a discussion with Funke about this. The airlines are concerned about SATM, and the reason they're concerned about it is they don't know what the impact is going to be. And funny enough, it's not so much the point-to-point stuff, it's the fifth freedom, it's the beyond traffic. Because the beyond traffic means somebody else from another area is going to maybe take some of my lunch from my market. And the problem that they want to see is reciprocal value. So it's not a question necessarily of not exchanging the fifth freedom rights. It's to make sure that if there's going to be a fifth freedom on one of my third and fourth freedom sectors, am I going to get potentially the fifth freedoms that I want out of that other market, for example? So I think that's, for me, is one of the big points that has to be dealt with, is the reciprocal value. And that's even coming from airlines that are quite successful. There is that hesitancy, and I understand that the study that's going to be done fairly shortly, I hope, will actually highlight that there is not a potential loss, because there is still that fear, which you put so well, that something is not going to work out for me.
Closing remarks, I'll start from you.
Well, this is a fascinating content to work on. It's been a pleasure to work on it for so many years in terms of the aviation industry. I'm an optimist, and I hope that we can actually pull this together totally and bring the whole package together. I hope that we can ensure that we get governments and industry to work together as partners on this aspect. From a safety and security perspective, pray that civil aviation authorities conduct their businesses as good oversight agencies, ensuring safety and security, but enable, also through their governments, to enable aviation to develop and grow in the way it must grow, and to try and achieve that close to double-digit growth if possible, to enable aviation to take its rightful place in global industry.
Funke?
Aviation is the business of freedom, right, and is a critical enabler for social and economic development. The SATM is a great initiative for Africa, and it's something that all African governments and key stakeholders should embrace. Let's work together more cooperatively across multiple sectors to see how we can use this great industry that has worked in other parts of the world to fast track and support the vision of the African Union of Africa's integration, prosperity, and unity.
All right, thank you so much. Garma, finally.
I stayed many years in aviation, and I have seen it grow from a very low base. Even though the progress has not been as good as we see in the Middle East or the Far East, there is progress. But I think now, with the new leaders insisting that certain has to be implemented, this is a golden opportunity for airlines to really forget the small market share that they are talking about and look for a bigger market share, which they are entitled to get and which they will get if they really put their efforts in it. They should believe in it, and they are not going to stop it. So it's better that they change their mind and support it.
All right. Thank you very much for getting time to speak to us. Thank you, Chris, Defunke, and Gama. I hope that any other time that we have conversations like this, we would have you to actually break down all the nitty-gritties that are involved in the aviation industry. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right. Allow us to leave it right here for this CNBC Africa Special Report on aviation. How do we see the single Africa air transporter market doing big and winning big for the continent? And as Garma said there, it is a very golden opportunity for African airlines. But CEOs need to stop looking at a small market share that they are currently operating with and look at a bigger scope here. Allow us to leave it right there. My name is Mugisha. For more, be sure to join us on Twitter at CNBC Africa. My personal handle at Galwera4. It's bye for now.